So this presentation comes out of the past few years. We've numerous times talked about patterns. We've talked about anti-patterns. We've talked about software patterns and project planning patterns and how they apply to Agile and just so many places. And all of these have been basically sourced from other people. Yeah, it's either in books or out on the web or something like that. And what I wanted to do is spend a little time in this presentation talking about how do you maybe build out your own patterns and anti-patterns, and how do you make something and say, hey, yeah, this is a pattern, as opposed to maybe just a habit or something like that. So in doing so, I'm going to talk, just sort of revisit what's a pattern, what are anti-patterns, how do you lean on your experience to build these out, touch on the rule of three or a version of the rule of three, and then how do you refine sort of your rough draft of what a pattern or anti-pattern is, and then the point of it sort of is how do you share your knowledge. So software patterns in particular, now there's numerous patterns that are out there in the IT world, but originally the idea was came from software patterns. They're highlighted and described in basically the early 90s. There's a book called Software Design Patterns. It's often referred to as the Gang of Four book because it's four authors that at the time it was, and they've all got, nice long names. It's not like, Smith, Jones, Brown, Bob, or something like that. It's longer names. And rather than have that big, long list of names, a lot of people just call it Gang of Four or even GOF. It's just one of those things because, hey, we're IT people, we shorten stuff up. A software pattern is just, it comes out, it's a common solution to a problem. It's where you see this problem over and over again. It's a pattern that says, here is a way to solve this problem. And it's usually comes out of multiple attempts to solve that problem. It's usually, successful attempts. And what are the commonalities? Because every time we solve a problem, there may be some slightly different facets to it. Some are very, very similar. If you think, for example, like a login for an application, the idea of solving the problem of how do I get a user into a system? How do I give them some ability to log in? How do I have them, what do I need to do to allow them to administer that? Like change password, forgot password, maybe enforcing some sort of password strength or security. Those things may vary a little bit, particularly like maybe you're implementing in a different language. Maybe the interface is a little different. Maybe the back end is a little different. But overall, patterns are they're not tied to a technology. They're sort of like a level above that. But then two, it's one of those that if you can get 80 or 90% there with a pattern, with a process or a series of steps, then that just jump starts you forward to get you to the stuff that are the more unique problems you need to solve. And so that's the key, is software patterns help us quickly build new solutions based on past work, either of ourselves or others. And it's going to be higher quality because we're reusing the lessons learned in the past. All of the concepts and the stumbles and the gotchas have been sort of baked into the pattern, so that we're much more likely to have something that's going to be successful, at least the pattern part of it. I mean, we can always screw it up, but it is something that we're going to be less likely to, because the thing, it's one of those things like knowledge gaps and not knowing what you don't know becomes less of an issue because other people have gone through this, or we're reviewing what we saw in the past and using that to inform us for solving this particular problem. Anti-patterns followed after the idea of patterns is, as people do, people started looking at it and saying, well, there's a lot of problems that we solve and we see how we should address this problem. But then they sort of went to the flip side and said, well, what about all of the situations where we say, here's a problem, and these are the ways you definitely do not want to do it, or here are the things you definitely do not want to get yourself into. And probably the most classic anti-pattern ever would be like painting yourself into a corner. And so those things exist all over the place, as do the patterns. And it made sense to say, well, let's start talking about anti-patterns, much as we do patterns, and sort of use them as cautionary tales, maybe, or warning signs that you want to avoid when you're building out a solution or designing a solution. And really what it is anti-patterns, a common, typical stumbling block that either reduces quality, increases your chance of failure, or maybe guarantees failure in some cases. But it's not necessarily just in failed projects. It may be things that occur in a successful project that you really just don't want to go through. Either it adds to the cost of maintainability, reduces performance, reduces scalability. It's really just, anti-patterns really come down to it. They're not focusing so much on failures as much as you almost want to call them like worst practices. If you hear about things that are best practices, if you do these things, you're more likely to have a better, more valuable solution. Anti-patterns are the opposite. These are the things that if you do these, it's going to really challenge your ability to produce the best solution. So it's really looking at just let's find a way to sort of categorize, document past mistakes, and provide a way that people can avoid making those mistakes. And in doing so, hopefully improve the velocity and quality of development efforts. And the key to all this is, so our next little step here is we're going to lean on our experience, because there are few teachers that are better than experience. It allows us to do things like avoid potholes, those bumps in the road, those challenges we run into that take up a lot of our time or cause us a lot of frustration, where in retrospect, we look back and say, I could have avoided that. Like a classic example would be if you don't back a machine up and your machine dies and you spend who knows how much time trying to recover what you lost. That's something going forward. You can say, hey, I need good backups. I need regular backups of my machine so I don't lose stuff. But we also can get out of experience, we can find some algorithms. We can find, as we solve a problem over and over again, we can take those specific solutions and turn them into general solutions. It's something that we can do to speed ourselves forward, because then we can basically reuse that solution now. It's if we've made a general case for it. Along the same ways is, while we can find common solutions or general solutions, we also are going to find among those general or common mistakes. A good example in coding is not capturing exceptions. It's not handling exceptions properly. And especially in certain languages and frameworks and formats and areas that we, just environments we can get into where we can use some sort of error handling and exception handling. It's not uncommon for us to just, sort of go through and code the happy path and not really think about those other things. Well, we can avoid doing so. We can look back and say, I had this thing and it gave me just ridiculous headaches. And if I had just properly tracked, logged, whatever output mistakes or exceptions, errors or exceptions, then it would have been a lot faster to handle. Experience also can teach us shortcuts. We can look at stuff and say, wow, I went through all of this extra work, but really I could have skipped 3 of those steps because they ended up being not very helpful. Or those things that I took steps solving that problem that were really, we'll call like research, is I had to look into some options. Like maybe I was faced with 3 different options. I ended up having to explore all 3, but now I know which one of those 3 options makes sense. So I can take a shortcut. I don't have to explore all 3 of those in the future. In a similar sense, experience is going to teach us common paths. There are going to be problems that we solve, sometimes they're going to be very different from past problems. And you feel like you've been here before. You maybe get sort of like that sense of deja vu. And you're going to realize that, oh, this is something I've had to do before. It may have been a completely different problem I was solving, but this step or these series of steps, I've seen them before. And so I have a better idea now of how to go forward because it feels familiar. It would be like traveling from one city to another, and there's maybe 10 different ways, but sometimes you're on sections of road or sections of the journey that you've been on before. So you're like, oh, okay, I know this. So I know that, there's a gas station up ahead or a restaurant or whatever. Likewise is experience that helps us along with potholes is avoiding the treacherous paths, we'll call them, the cases where, yeah, we can do that, but it's risky or time consuming or costly or whatever it happens to be. So we can also sort of just keep our heads up sometimes. It'd be like climbing a mountain. If you've scaled the side of a cliff and, done free climbing or one of those kinds of things, I haven't, but I'm going to assume that there are things that you learn going from one to another about just how the handholds are, how far you can step, how far you can swing, what can hold your weight and what can't, all those kinds of things that experience teach us. It's basically that, hey, if I do this, if I take this path, then here's some things I'm going to need to do to be safe or to increase my chance of success. So we get a lot out of experience. And now, although this is, threw this one out there, with the rule of three, this is not the 3 laws of robotics, which is a very different rule of three. Rule of three in general, actually, there's many ways that it shows up. We're going to talk about a specific one that we're going to call sort of a rule of three. There are other ones related to sales and marketing and things like that. But in this case, we're going to talk about doing something 3 times. Because there's something sort of magical about that, and maybe not magical. It's if you think of doing something like in a sweeping motion, like if you, I don't know, like take a broom and sweep it across the floor, the first time you sweep it across, you'll get, whatever it is, 60, 70% of the dust. And if you do it again, you'll probably take some more dust. If you do it again, you'll take some more, but now you're down to probably a very minimal amount of dust. Same kind of thing with doing almost any task. And in solving problems, typically what we do is the first time we solve a problem is we're really solving more or less for a specific case. We may see opportunities where this can be used generally, but we're still solving for that specific case. The second time we see it, now we've got 2 things to compare, the first attempt and the second attempt. And that's going to help us to generalize the solution. I was going to say, hey, now we've seen it a second time. Let's take this solution and make it more general case. And then by the time we get to the third time, now we should be able to see far more, for lack of a better term, patterns in the problem and how we're going to solve it. We've generalized it. And now we've even sort of tested that generalization because we did it for we did the specific for the first time. We created a general solution the second time. And now by the time we see it the third time, we're going to try to use that general solution and try to apply it to the third. And there may be some refinements and stuff that come in when we do it that third time. But now by the time we've gone through 3 times, we've essentially tested the solution 3 different ways. We've seen, we may not have seen outliers, but we've probably seen a good portion of what this problem is typically going to look like. So by the time we get through 3, we should be pretty confident what we've got is a good general case solution. That doesn't mean that there won't be, that there aren't bugs, that there aren't issues, but doing it that third time typically is going to get us, really close to where we need to be. You're going to see maybe you will see a lot of changes the second time through, because now you're really highlighting what's the same and what's the difference. You're going to see a few changes probably the third time you do it, but then as you go to the fourth and the fifth and the sixth, it'll be maybe changes here and there, but it's definitely going to be less, should be, unless you're doing it wrong, less each iteration. And eventually you're going to get into cases where you're also going to be able to determine that, oh, well, this should change, but it's an outlier. This is not part of the really that true general case or general solution. So thinking about that with the idea of patterns and anti-patterns, is really, it comes down to, it's simpler than probably it sounds, is that we're going to see problems and we're going to see the same problem over and over again. So when we want to sit down and say, what would be a pattern, or when we want to start building out our patterns and anti-patterns, and a reason for this is both personal, so that we can become better developers, and also for our organization, because there will be organizational patterns. For example, if you think about financial organizations or healthcare organizations or organizations that deal with government, there are problems that they see that other industries, other organizations may not. And then even a specific company, a specific business will see things that maybe their competitors maybe don't. And so there's going to be sort of like levels of specificity of patterns and anti-patterns. And so as we're doing our work and building, with the idea of becoming a better developer and trying to think about what are some of our own patterns and anti-patterns, first thing we want to do is look for common functionality or steps when we're going from problem to problem, application to application, page to page, whatever it is. Where are there things that we're having to think through that are repeated? Where is a repetition of either functionality or requirements, problem definitions, and even across solutions? Because there may be things that it doesn't really pop up in the problem, but if you look at the solution, you realize that, oh, we had all these different problems that we solved, but by the time we got to the end, here are the things that we had sort of drop out on the back end, that were part of the solution that are very similar. And maybe this is now a pattern we need to front load so we don't try to solve it while we're, doing our application. A good example would be data audit record type information. So if you're doing some sort of application that needs an audit trail, such as what was changed, who changed it, when was it changed, then you'll find, and especially if you do this across a bunch of different applications, you'll see that it really doesn't matter too much what the application is. There's the same couple of steps that you're going to do over and over again. And there is a pattern for that. And so it's something that you may say, okay, this is a pattern that we can use as we go through all the other future applications, and somebody answers a question that as a positive that says, do we need some sort of audit history or audit trail? And there's also going to be anti-patterns. There's going to be things you're going to look at through that, and you're going to say, oh my gosh, this was not the way to do it. This did not scale, or whatever it was. And so you're going to see those anti-patterns as well. You're going to see, particularly when you look in the world of Agile, if you look at retrospectives, that could be a great opportunity for anti-patterns, because you may see things that are in actually both patterns and anti-patterns, because you may see things that recur in the what we did right or what we want to do categories would be more your patterns. And then the things that let's not do that again, or we need to do less of that, would be, maybe point to some anti-patterns.